From the Toronto Star, I'm Saba Eitizaz, and this matters.
For now you suffer the pain of silence. My body deceives me, I'm suffering today. For all the years that I worked, I know no relief. Retirement and illness, that is my reward.
That was Roger Fowler, a former General Electric employee, reciting his pain to honor those who had died of cancer. This was published during the Star investigation by Sara Mojtehedzadeh, documenting the story of hundreds of workers at GE Peterborough, their decades-long exposure to cancer-causing substances, and their unending struggle to get compensation for a range of often terminal illnesses. What has changed in the 4 years since? A new report sent to the Labour Ministry has some disturbing findings. Hundreds of thousands of Ontarians are being exposed to carcinogens on the job. This is a place where most workers spend a third of their day. Almost 3,000 cases of cancer diagnosed each year are linked to workplace hazards. And yet, there are no systems in place to find out just how bad this is and how workers can get the help they need. Today, I talked to the Star's Work and Wealth reporter, Sara Mojtehedzadeh, who's been investigating this, about what's in this report and why sick workers or their surviving families are left to suffer for years, struggling to seek compensation or to prevent exposure in the first place. Thank you so much, Sara, for joining me on the podcast.
No problem.
So first of all, when we're talking about occupational cancer, I want to know what kind of work are we talking about that exposes its employees to this and how big a risk this is for those workplaces?
Yeah, I mean, we know that hundreds of thousands of Ontarians are exposed to substances on the job that could potentially cause cancer. And we know that there's about 3,000 cases of cancer that are caused by the workplace every year in the province. And it's really a huge range of workplaces where these risks exist. So one of the biggest ones and the sort of more historical ones is asbestos. So we're talking about old manufacturing facilities across Ontario, which was, once the bread and butter of our economy, that used asbestos in its manufacturing process. But we're also talking about a whole range of risks that exist to this day. Now we know the kind of the toxic consequences of asbestos, but there's still a ton of substances or exposures that workers face on the job today that continue to be a huge risk in terms of cancer. It can be everything from prolonged sun exposure if you're someone who works outside in construction, for example. It can be exposure to diesel fumes. That's another big one. And then, we're also talking about folks like migrant workers who are exposed to a range of chemicals on the job. And a lot of these substances we know cause cancer. Others, there's a lack of research in terms of what the potential health consequences could be. So all in all, it's a risk for workers who have historically worked in these kind of manufacturing sectors, but it's also a risk for precarious workers today who may be exposed to chemicals and may not be getting the training that they need to keep themselves safe.
And it's interesting that you mentioned migrant workers as well, a lot of them in the agricultural sector. And those are people who wouldn't traditionally even have access to the support or protections that others might over here, such as unions and other protocols that could help safeguard them, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that these areas of precarious work really are an emerging kind of weak point for our health and safety system in the province, because they're workers who, like you say, don't have access to a union, who historically would have, advocated for workers, maybe helped track exposures. These workers don't have the benefit of that, and add on to that language barriers, spending part of the year in another country. It's really difficult to track what kind of exposures are happening. Workers may not even be aware how dangerous the chemicals that they're being exposed to are. Last year, I actually visited a town in Mexico. I was doing a project on migrant workers, and just anecdotally in this one town, numerous people came up to me and said that their partners, their husbands had after years of work in Canada, developed cancer and died in Mexico. And there's very little research that is actually looking systematically at what are the long-term effects of this chemical exposure. And one of the kind of complications is that it takes so long, obviously, for cancer to develop. There's a latency period between exposure and actually developing the cancer. So it can often be very hard to track the cause of it. And if you're a worker who develops cancer 20 years down the line, maybe you've retired, maybe in the case of a migrant worker, you've gone back to your home country permanently, there's very little to connect the dots there, especially if you don't have the supports that were traditionally in place, like a union.
And you mentioned about the very little research which ties into this new report, which is submitted to the Ministry of Labor. What are some of the most disturbing findings from that? What does it say? I do know that it mentions something about there not being enough information or research into this.
Yeah, so the report that was submitted to the Ministry of Labor was really a culmination of a lot of advocacy and a lot of people raising concerns that the province was not doing enough to track and prevent people getting cancer because of workplace exposure. And it really kind of, I think, consolidates what a lot of people have been saying for a long time, which is that the province capacity, its scientific capacity and its enforcement capacity to detect these things is quite broken. So in fact, the province is not effectively tracking this information at all. It's dismantled the bulk of its kind of investigative arm that dealt with occupational exposure to chemicals and carcinogens. So there's very little information on where we may see clusters of cancer emerging, and that makes it difficult to prevent if you don't know where it's happening on a kind of systematic basis. So the report really highlighted the lack of scientific capacity, the lack of prevention strategies at the provincial level. And it also talked about our existing legislation in terms of what diseases we treat as being work-related. So I did a big story a few years ago about workers at General Electric in Peterborough, and they had gotten in touch with me initially because hundreds of them had gotten cancer after years of working in this big plant. Many of them had struggled to receive compensation at the Workers' Compensation Board. And really the struggle was that it's incredibly difficult as it stands to prove to the level demanded by the board that your cancer was caused by your workplace. And you throw into the mix that these are families that are often grieving, that are dealing with a terminal illness, and then have to go through this incredibly difficult bureaucratic process of trying to cobble enough evidence together to make their claim. And we have a very short list of diseases that we say, okay, there's enough existing evidence that we will assume if you file a claim for them that the cancer was caused by your workplace, there's enough scientific evidence to support a connection between the two. There's only about 5 or so diseases that we recognize in that list in Ontario, whereas other countries have much longer lists. And that makes it much easier for workers who develop those illnesses to make their case and get compensation from their workers' compensation system. And so the report recommends expanding that list because scientific evidence has evolved, and the report is essentially saying is we haven't kept up as a province.
So it seems like the report is talking about the system being outdated and perhaps it needs to be overhauled to deal with this huge number that we're seeing and with the fact that detection of diseases and cancer-related diseases has evolved so much since then, and there's so many different kinds now.
I think many advocates would say it does need to be completely overhauled. There's so many different pieces to it that just need to be revamped. At the Ministry of Labor level, there needs to be greater capacity to investigate potential clusters of people getting exposed to substances. At the Compensation Board, there needs to be greater scientific research capacity to make sure that the scientific evidence that is relied on to make huge decisions about what compensation people are entitled to after they fall sick. That capacity needs to be rebuilt. And then the other piece of this is medical training that doctors receive. A lot of people who get cancers that are caused by their workplace, it's first detected by their primary care provider, their GP. And, a lot of GPs are not trained to really sort of dig into whether there were workplace exposures and to treat that as kind of a routine part of, how they deal with their patients. And so another kind of piece of this report is saying that needs to change, and occupational risk and assessing occupational risk needs to be a big part of how medical students are trained and how existing physicians are trained in terms of identifying those risks.
And Sara, you just were talking about the struggle of the GE Peterborough workers, and after decades-long exposure to cancer-causing substances. Through that story, just take me through this. What kind of challenges would a sick worker or their families face if they try to present their case to the Workplace Safety and Insurance Board and get help?
For those families, it was and it has been just a really devastating, exhausting battle. For a lot of these workers, they, started working at the plant when they were 15, 16 years old, often didn't have a formal education beyond that, really often trained themselves on the job with the help of their union to identify risks. And thankfully, one worker in particular had meticulously documented all of the exposures that workers were seeing on the job on a routine basis. But even with that evidence, it was extremely difficult for those workers to make their case at the board. Obviously, General Electric maintained consistently throughout the process that they had taken all the appropriate health and safety measures. There were major disputes about even the layout of the plant and how that would have caused risks to workers in terms of fumes kind of wafting through the plant. And a lot of workers felt like the evidence that they presented was not given the same weight as the evidence that their very powerful employer presented to the board. And, as I kind of mentioned earlier, on top of that, you're talking about workers who are either terminally ill or they've already passed away and their families are having to make their case on their behalf. And, they don't even have that firsthand testimony from the worker because they've already lost their struggle with often a very devastating illness. It's an extremely long process as well. It can take years and years and years to, make the claim. If it's denied, to appeal it. There's, multiple levels of appeal that workers have to go through. And it's just, what a lot of them told me is it's just exhausting. It's too exhausting to continue with in some cases. And so cases just get dropped. So after sort of writing about all of the evidence that did exist to prove these exposures, the board agreed to review all of the cancer claims that had previously denied. It ended up overturning, I think, 73 of those cases and acknowledging that there were workplace exposures that caused cancer. But there's definitely still families who are struggling to get compensation and whose claims have continually been denied. So it's just a very difficult situation for those families.
And as the report mentions, it's talking about big numbers here, almost 3,000 people with cancer diagnosed each year in Ontario due to this. What does this number say to you about safety standards in the workplace in the first place? Do you think working conditions are getting any better since a few decades ago? Because these are still big numbers.
Yeah, I think that in some ways, absolutely, our health and safety system has improved. Some of these workers, for example, at General Electric, were working there before we even had an Occupational Health and Safety Act. So there's absolutely been progress on that front. And we know that employers are legally required to prevent workplace exposures and do everything in their power to prevent those exposures. I think what's changed is really the structure of work and the fact that Today, a lot of workers are not spending their entire career in one location. They're often moving from workplace to workplace. Like if you're a cleaner, for example, and you're using potentially toxic chemicals every day, you're probably moving between 3 different grocery stores at any given time, for example. And so it's only going to get harder to track those exposures. And again, a lot of these workers who in today's day and age are being exposed are workers who don't have a union, who don't even have colleagues to compare notes with and say, hey, like this chemical is making me feel kind of sick, and to really kind of informally at least track problems that could create health risks down the line. So I think the question is whether our existing health and safety regime and prevention regime has adapted to this new reality where some of the old kind of supports that at least somewhat helped workers make their case have evaporated in a lot of cases.
And we've been talking about this, that the province has dismantled much of its scientific capacity and organizations for detecting and addressing these kind of illnesses. Do you think that's the biggest roadblock when it comes to ensuring safe workspaces and helping get compensation? What other roadblocks are there?
Yeah, I think that prevention obviously is huge. And even in the past couple of years, we've seen cuts to the Ministry of Labor's prevention budget. So I think that that continues to be a problem. The ministry has also, part of those cuts, reduced its funding to research projects that were looking at things like occupational cancer. And I think that that's going to be a huge problem because without the research and without scientific evidence evolving, again, it's going to be really difficult for workers to make a case for compensation claims. And we know that, even where there is research, it's often focused on male-dominated workplaces, like the traditional kind of manufacturing plant. And it's not looking, historically, has not focused as much on, for example, women and women's exposure to toxic substances in the workplace. Again, it hasn't focused on precarious workers and migrant workers. And so there's a gap in our knowledge there that I think needs to be filled if we're to understand the risks better and then prevent them from happening.
Thank you for your time, Sara. You've been great as always.
Thank you.
That was the Star's Work and Wealth reporter, Sara Mojtehedzadeh. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Saba Eitizaz, Adrian Chung, and Raju Mutter. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.